Hi everyone, I'm Barry from the University of Manchester, and today I've got Kiri with me, my colleague, who's going to be talking about business etiquette and working across culturally. Thank you all for joining us during our Asia Careers Insight series, and without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Kiri.
Thank you, Baris, and hi everyone, and welcome to this session. I hope you're really looking forward to it. It's very strange being introduced, as I'm usually on the other side, introducing speakers for our Asia Careers Insight series. I'll turn my camera off to let you concentrate on the slides. But as Baris mentioned today, we'll pretty much talk a little bit about working across cultures, the basic principles of communications, and how you interact with people in various international environments and in diverse team, and hopefully that will really help you understand the different backgrounds that people come from and also how you can work more effectively with them. And just to say, this session is being recorded and we'll take all the questions at the end, so please do send them in throughout the session because I'll be really looking forward for your own comments and questions. Trying to get to my next slide. There we go. So just before we start, just a little bit about myself, just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. I've been working in international environments for the last several years, and I'm currently working at the University of Manchester Employer Engagement Team, trying to build relations with employers and organizations outside the UK, looking to employ all our EU and international students back in their home countries. So based on that, I will share with you my top tips on how to adapt your own work style and communications, build relationships, and interact with people from diverse backgrounds. This will be helpful both now while you're students and have to collaborate with your course mates, but also later in life, hopefully when you become working professionals. So before we start, I think it's important to consider what is culture and how do we define that. For me, culture is what it makes us who we are. Culture starts from the moment we're born, it's our attitudes, our beliefs, our values, is what brings us together with people, is that commonality that we have with a certain group of people, whether it's that commonality of language, heritage, race, religion, or something else. And it creates a membership with others. And then that also affects our perspective of everything else in the world. So we see everything through our cultural lenses. And because we've got different people with different cultures, then we've got a lot of different people with different perspectives in the world. So where do we differ? So all of us are very different and we're unique. So we talk differently, we behave differently, we react to situations very differently. We've got very different names, my name being one of them, a very unusual name in the UK, a very common name where I come from, one that is very difficult to pronounce. We all use different words, different phrases, we've got different habits, we eat different things, we celebrate different holidays, we interact with people in a different way, and then what might be very common to you might be unfamiliar to me. So we've got, including that, we've got very different attitudes to work. So you might have seen through group projects at university or at school, or through your part-time roles, for example, that people tend to work very differently. They've got a very different approach to how they work and very different expectations of you as well. And that's why it's important to be able to be flexible and adopt different approaches to connecting with others and building relationships. One thing I would like to point out, though, before we get down to the nitty-gritty of what culture is and how different people across different nations, for example, have different cultures and different characteristics and patterns of behavior, is to point out that these are broad generalities. Try not to solely reduce someone's character traits purely down to their culture. We're talking about patterns of behavior, but don't restrict like people in your mind, depending on that, as we all come from very different cultures. What we'll talk about today is that sort of like feeling we can expect from a nation as a whole, because I will focus a little bit more on culture in terms of where you're coming from your home countries. But then, as I said, people individually can be very, very different, and they might not conform to your stereotypes or your expectations. So what I would like to focus firstly on, to give you a little bit of like background for a couple of like slides and spend some time on, is this very famous Lewis model outlining the different culture types in various countries, which Lewis splits into 3 groups: the multi-active, the linear active, and then the reactive. Don't worry if this looks like very complicated. We'll go through certain trends and the characteristics of each type of culture one by one, but this is pretty much the basis of what I will talk to you today. So first, this graph outlines the difference in cultures and countries around the world spread across the triangle. And there are like remarkable differences in how people talk, behave, react to situations, or even their attitudes towards work, their expectations, and their method they go about building relationships, as we've talked about. So for example, you see that on some corners, like for example here, you've got the super linear active, like the Swiss, which are at the very top of the triangle. And then you'll find other countries, for example, like Belgium, India, Canada, which are in the middle of the triangle, in the middle of each side, which are more hybrid, and then they adopt characteristics from both sides of the triangle. So what I would like you to think is how you present yourselves to others, either in the UK, and how people in other nations, especially in your home country, like what people in other nations and people in your home country know about you and your typical like tendencies. And then I'll explain to you now a little bit more what we mean by multi-active, linear active, and reactive, and what we expect these countries' characteristics to be. So for example, at the top of the triangle here, this red area, we find the South American countries, Mediterranean countries, and to some extent, some of the Middle Eastern and African countries. This red area describes very warm, very emotional, very expressive, and to some degree, impulsive people. One thing I want to highlight is that even though you'll find countries who are geographically close by on the other corners of the triangle, here you will find countries which are geographically scattered. However, their behaviors, they follow the same patterns in their behavior and share many commonalities, such as how social they are, how time for them might be a little bit more fluid, how sometimes they're uneasy with strict deadlines, and generally, as I mentioned, they're like more expressive and more emotional to some degree. At the bottom here, at the bottom left, you will see that we've got a lot of the Western European countries, including the UK, where you're all studying at, and the rest of the English-speaking world, such as the US, Australia, New Zealand. So judging from your knowledge of like British culture, I think it might come as no surprise that the characteristics of this blue corner is people being very factual, very logical, concerned with punctuality. It's people who may express themselves with directness, but might use limited body language and are generally seen as very cool and not very emotional, so very, very composed in some way. And then now here at the other side of the triangle, the yellow corner, we find the East and Southeast Asia countries, and then these cultures tend to be much more quieter, they're more subtle and courteous in their interactions. Some might say they're more amiable, accommodating, even compromising in the way they work with others or interact with others. These regions here, the people from these regions here in the yellow corner, they tend to like listen first before they act, so they're less impulsive compared to the multi-active countries here. So yeah, they tend to like listen first before they act or speak. And just to give you one example, just think of how you will normally think of a Japanese person as being, I don't know, an exemplar of like calmness and collectiveness. So that's what the characteristics of this yellow corner here are. So you can imagine that in situations where you mix this kind of people together, you need to be very delicate and methodical about how you approach your interactions with them, either in your personal or professional life. And then even if you disagree with the Lewis model here, you think that, oh, these countries don't necessarily, the culture of these countries doesn't necessarily conform to what Lewis is claiming they do, you might still agree that we can still see some similar tendencies and still divide people throughout the world into 3 groups of similar characteristics. So the linear active, the multi-active, and the reactive. So even if you don't think these are correlated to countries or regions or cultures, this is still a nice way of like thinking of how people react and communicate and interact with each other. So as we mentioned in the yellow side of the triangle, the reactive people tend to listen more and react to people later. So instead of being assertive or interrupting, they wait and compose their responses or even react later. They may even often ask for you to repeat yourself and explain again. So keep this in mind when you're working with them on projects that they might need a longer time and a bit of a more in-depth explanation. They tend to be very polite and indirect. They will very unlikely to confront you. They want harmony in the relationships, and they're very people oriented as well. They prefer face-to-face meetings. They often have very subtle body language. Their hands don't move a lot. They're not very animated or expressive. They remain very still, but they still want to interact with people and be very people oriented. You may have worked with people like this in your university projects, for example, so you will know how they are not always the first ones to jump in with their opinions, but they will wait for you to say what you think the best course of action is and then react to your suggestions. Sometimes, even if they disagree, they will go with your suggestions to avoid conflict and so as not to upset you. But be very mindful that they expect the same thing from you as well. So try to be flexible and to reciprocate. And just to point out, there's no right or wrong answer here, or a right or wrong way of being. It's just a different like working style and a different behavior type. So it's really important to have a mixture of both in a team in order to balance off each other. So moving on to the linear active group, where we find, as said, the US and Western Europe and some of the Scandinavian countries. Their characteristics are much different. These people do much more talking, but not at all times. So there's a little bit more of a balance there. They don't monopolize the conversation essentially, and they focus on planning, are very driven by logic. They tend to stick to the facts. They like having a clear agenda for meetings, and they're very results oriented. So at work, they will focus less on building relationships. So unlike the reactive people that are very people oriented and they work a lot on building those relationships, so they might be a lot more likely to take out for lunch, for example, and get to know you before they do business with you. The linear active people are just a lot more focused on delivering results. So anything written is important to them. They like order. They like to see contracts as a formal document that once signed, it must be adhered to. And then compared to other countries where contracts, for example, might be seen as a starting point for negotiation or even as something that can be easily modified and flexible, for them, that's not the case. Anything written to them is a lot more formal and set in stone. And again, their body language is restrained. They can be polite and very discreet, but you won't find them using a lot of gestures, facial expressions, or being excessively animated by moving their hands. And then back again, if you remember at the top of the triangle there, the red corner, we've got the multi-active group where you see the different South American nations, Middle Eastern countries, India coming in just a little bit there. And just say India is a very interesting case as it is a hybrid. So now these people are much more talkative. And just imagine someone from Venezuela or Mexico, for example, having a conversation with someone from Vietnam or Japan. How difficult it would be to keep a balance in this conversation, where one person would be more prone to allowing space and silence and contemplation, while the other is much more chatty and will only allow someone else to take a turn at talking only if they're interrupted. So keep in mind that multi-active groups do several things at once, so they're really good multitaskers, but also time is much more fluid to them, so they might have a harder time keeping to deadlines and being punctual, for example. So for them, it's much more common for them to be just on time than on time. So they're running late for things a lot. So their spoken words and what they agree verbally usually holds a lot of value, and sometimes even more compared to a contract, because again, they will focus on relationships and building that relationship. So what they think that they've verbally agreed holds a high value for them. They are very emotional and they express themselves through a very unrestrained body language. Their arms will be moving around and their faces will be much more animated compared to the other groups, and they will be much more vocal about disagreement. So you'll often find them disagreeing or being louder in places, but that doesn't mean that they're not respectful of each other. That's just the way they express themselves. For them, it is very feelings first. They are very relationship oriented as well. But if you go, and for example, if you go into a business meeting with some of these people, you're very likely to talk about your personal life, such as your family, before you even get down to business. And they may even refuse to do business with you until you've met their families or you know more about their personal lives, so they can get that feeling that they can trust you and that you've connected on some personal level beyond a professional level. And keep in mind that they might talk to you about anything, so a topic which may even be deemed unprofessional to bring up in business conversations with people from these other nations and groups. We find that in this corner, in this red multi-active like corner, there's a stark difference in how they behave and conduct business compared to the other groups and the rest of the world. So now let's look on how you can market yourself effectively and deal with people of various cultures and make a great impression by looking to some of the finer details, and then I'll be able to give you some tips as well. So one thing to keep in mind always is punctuality. We've talked about how different nations and cultures may perceive time differently. For example, being on time in the UK is key to make a good impression, but on other nations, instead in Latin America, for example, you'll find that the idea of sticking to a deadline and agreed times is a little bit more relaxed. In India or Greece, where I'm from, it is very common to say, I don't know, let's meet at noon, and then both parties will just show up at 2 o'clock, and there's that mutual understanding that they will both parties will be late. So be very careful with this in the UK if you're getting started on a new job specifically. So if a starting time for a meeting or for an interview or for an appointment is set, you are expected to adhere to it and even be there early so you can start at the agreed time. So the time that you're given is not the time that you showed up. You show up 5 minutes early so you can start at the time that is given to you. It's a show of really good manners, really good etiquette, and a show of like respect. Additionally, I think that's a bit more universal across cultures, is the importance of appearances and the way you present yourself. So make sure, to be washed, brushed, and in business dress if appropriate when you're meeting someone in person or even online these days. It's really important to take the time to at least present yourself nicely. Business attire may vary from region to region or from sector to sector. So for example, I'm sure you will all know that in Silicon Valley, it would maybe more acceptable to show up at a tech firm in a t-shirt and jeans, but in Asia, for example, you are expected to be in full business suit, and if you're a woman, to be wearing heels, for example. Some countries even have national dresses or uniforms that people will wear when conducting business. So make sure not to make any cultural insensitive comments about them, to be aware of them. And, if you're in a situation where someone wears something unusual, something you've never seen before, it is okay to ask questions and to ask for an explanation. People love to explain and talk about themselves, so don't feel intimidated by that. If you're ever unsure of the situation, overdressing is always better. And whenever you want to make a great impression, always dress smartly, as it shows a great deal of respect and commitment. Often you will be invited to networking events specifying a dress code, which makes it easier. And then I've realized a lot with students that one thing that the dress code tends to always be business casual, and that's one of these questions I get a lot by students: is what is business culture? What is business casual? What are we expected to wear? And I wanted to touch a little bit more on that. So business casual essentially means formal trousers and formal shoes for men, so no sneakers, including a shirt. A blazer or a vest and a tie are not optional, but I will recommend. They're always a nice touch. And then for women, that would be skirts or trousers, so no jeans, with a blouse. As for heels, I personally don't consider them essential unless you're comfortable with them and you want to wear them, but I will generally recommend closed-toe shoes and low heels if you want to go for heels. I speak to recruiters all the time, and they really do stress this a lot to me. The way you dress and the way, especially when you first meet them, either at an event or an online interview, and showing up on time, the way you carry yourself, it really, really matters to them. So what I find interesting though, and again, drawing back to how different cultures may perceive things differently, is the way that recruiters will talk about this to me. So for example, UK employers will tell me how if a student shows up without the proper business attire at an interview, they will interpret this as an unprofessional behavior and a lack of interest in the role from their part. But recruiters in Asia will focus on the fact that if someone shows up without the proper business attire, that is just a sign of poor respect towards them. So they will both think that it's a no-no, but they will describe it in a very different way. They will both frown upon it, but for different reasons, as they interpret your actions very differently. So let's look a little bit more closely then how you introduce yourself, either in person, and then later on we'll also talk about how you introduce yourself online as well. So there are various ways to do this around the world. For example, in Japan, you're expected to bow down, and the person who feels like is the less senior will bow the lower. However, in different parts of the world, that will be very different. In the UK, there is this acceptance of complete equality, your seniority, your gender, your age, anything else doesn't matter. The way you will introduce yourself is with a firm, assertive handshake. So while a handshake is widely accepted way of introducing yourself, keep in mind that the perception of personal space and physical boundaries varies from nation to nation. So in the UK, we stand in a bit of a medium distance from each other, not too close, but not too far, to allow for conversation, but also not to show disinterest. But then there's countries where, due to religious reasons, for example, men and women will often not be able to shake hands or choose not to. And then a way around it would be to rather touch their chest instead, instead of like giving a handshake. And then there's even countries where people feel a little bit more comfortable with you from the start, so they might even like greet you with a kiss on the cheek, or 2 kisses or 3, again depending on where in the world you come from, as that's very common to them. And then of course, just to put things a little bit into content, we're going through a pandemic right now, so it is more socially acceptable to greet people by touching elbows instead, or not by touching at all, so to maintain your distance instead of giving someone a handshake. And then again, reverting back to how you will normally introduce yourself pre-pandemic and hopefully after the pandemic in an in-person either event or meeting, one thing to keep in mind is business cards, and you might want to consider getting some business cards for yourself. Now, you will think that it's easy, there is not really an etiquette in doing so, but I think we can agree that there's actually an etiquette there that you have to be very mindful of and try to adhere to as much as possible. So for example, if you're in East Asia, you will hold your business card with both hands. You will make sure that the person can read your card as you're handing it to them. So make sure it's face up, make sure it's facing the person you're handing it to so they can read it, and make sure it's not upside down. And then make sure you hand your business card at the start of the meeting, because this is the most common thing you will do. If you go into a meeting with lots of people from Asia, they will start off by exchanging business cards, and then they will get down to the meeting because it's a sign of respect for them. So once you get handed the business card, one thing that is crucial, especially again in these countries from Asia, like when you meet people from these countries from Asia, is to take time to study the business card that has been handed to you. So read them while the person is handing them to you, while the person is right next to you. And don't put them in your back pocket without reading them. Don't write anything on them. Just keep the business card as it is, because that's a sign of acknowledgement and respect to the other person. In the UK, on the other hand, so there's a bit of a difference there. None of that applies at all, and it doesn't matter if you hand it with one hand, if you make a note on it or not, or if you bow, or if you hand it at the start of the meeting. It's perfectly acceptable to have a conversation with someone first and ask for someone to hand over their business card at the end of your discussion. I personally find that collecting business cards, if you're meeting someone, is a great way to remember their names afterwards. And you've got a record of who you've met at an event, and then afterwards you can go on LinkedIn, you can look them up because you now remember and have their name written down and not them, so you can remain connected afterwards. And then moving on to how you will introduce yourself via email. If you're getting introduced to someone over email, I will always recommend that you start your first email by addressing them formally, but subsequently it's okay to greet them with more informally. So always start off by saying dear instead of hi, but then subsequently it's okay to say hello to that person instead of like keep saying dear and their name. I think one sign of great respect and something quite nice that you can do is to greet them with the name they've chosen to sign off their last email to you. So for example, if you don't know their name, go off what their email address says, or how they've been introduced to you, and use a formal sort of like way of addressing them if you think that's more appropriate. So use Mr. or Mrs. or Miss followed by their surname. But then if they sign off, with their first name, especially if they use like a shorter version of their name or a different version of their name, use that name instead, because that's clearly the name they prefer to be known as. So for example, you'll find that a lot of like either students from China or Chinese employers I work with will sign off emails using a Western name instead of their given Chinese name. So respect that and don't go off their name in their email address, but with what they've signed their email off, as that's clearly their preferred way of being called. Also, again, a bit of a personal preference there. There's something that infuriates me like more than people getting my gender wrong. So, if you're unsure, if you're not quite sure of what gender someone might be, just use generic pronouns like they and them. I have an unusual name, so I can see how it's easy to get people confused. But, many people like me, and you'll see there on the slides, do include their gender they identify with in their email, just to make it easier for you to know what gender they're in, and just to help you address them correctly. If you're uncertain if a name is male or female, say the name Alex in the UK can be both male and female, a quick look on someone's LinkedIn profile and their picture may help you. But again, be very mindful that, of course, we can't be presumptuous about what gender someone might choose to identify with and how people might prefer to be addressed. So if you're ever uncertain of your level of formality expected from you, use dear instead of hi, and Mr., Mrs., or Miss followed by last name, and use their preferred pronouns. And again, you might want to even consider creating an email signature for any emails that you send through, even on your student email account, and add your preferred pronouns there as well, just to make it easier for other people to address you correctly. So again, looking a little bit more at written communications and what is expected of you, we find that the majority of communications nowadays, especially when in-person interaction has been reduced due to the events of the last year, you will now spend a lot more time communicating with people online, either via email or through different social platforms such as LinkedIn or WeChat, for example. So make sure and remember that just because something is taking place online doesn't mean that the same rules of etiquette don't apply as you will apply if you were meeting someone in person. So make sure you are as polite over email as you will be in person. And then you might want to consider, what is the most time-effective way of communicating with someone? Is email actually the right way of communicating, or will another channel be more appropriate? So sometimes it is easier to call someone. Now Zoom meetings have now become the norm a little bit more nowadays. So it's important to remember that when working in international environments, you are communicating with people across different time zones, and they might be using different channels. Some of those channels might not be accessible. So think of mainland China, for example, where Google, YouTube, and Facebook might be blocked without the use of a VPN. So just keep in the back of your mind, what's the best way to communicate with people? What's the most time-effective way? If you want to if it's a quick question, you might consider texting or a phone call. If it's something that you want to discuss more in depth, you might set a Zoom meeting up. If it's something that you want to have a written record of, or something that is not urgent and you can wait for I don't know, 24 hours or 48 hours for a response, then maybe email is the best way to go. But one more thing to keep in mind, that for phone calls, for example, phone calls might also sometimes not even be practical because of people working or living in different time zones. So keep this in mind when opening up emails by saying good morning or good afternoon, as a recipient might not be always receiving them at the same time as you. You may want to add in a pleasantry, such as something like greetings from an unusually sunny day in Manchester, or to make the email a little bit more personable or more a little bit more like friendly. But just keep this in mind that when you're working might not be necessarily the time that someone else is working. And even now that a lot of our students, I know, will not be on campus, and you might be studying from back in your home country, and you might be doing projects with each other. Just be very mindful that not everyone is on the same time zone as you. And another thing to consider is that the working week might not be the same for everyone as well. For example, in Arab countries or other countries with large Muslim populations, the working week may be Sunday to Thursday instead of Monday to Friday, with Friday and Saturday being the days of rest instead. Again, one thing that is not universal across the world is working hours, which may vary. In the UK, it is standard to work 9 to 5, but so in my home country, for example, schools start at 7:45, so it's more common for parents to drop off their kids at school and to go straight at work afterwards, hence start their work day a little bit earlier. And then keep in mind that in countries like China, or generally throughout Asia, it is very common for people to work much later as well, up to like 6 or 7 in the evening, or sometimes later. And then what I see a lot more nowadays is now countries which are slowly introducing either a 4-day working week or a 6-hour working day instead, to boost productivity. So again, keep in mind that what you might think is expected, or the usual way of doing things, is not universal across the world. So as I mentioned, keep this in mind when sending emails to clients, to colleagues, to course mates across the world, and don't expect an immediate response, as they may not be at the office at the time, or they might be sleeping, or they might be doing something else. So when working across cultures, one thing that I find I tend to do a lot is to allow for additional time when working with projects from people across the world, because time zones is one of these things that can hinder your ability to reach someone instantly, and it might cause up to a 24-hour delay with communication. So it is always advisable to acknowledge emails as soon as you receive them, so the person that you're communicating with does not wonder whether you've received it or not, whether you're actioning it. And then if you cannot action it immediately, just say and just ensure the sender that you've read the email, and that you will action it as soon as possible. And as I've mentioned, in those situations, you may want to try texting, but again, keep in mind that while WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, and Telegram are very popular apps for texting in Western countries, they may be blocked in others, and you may have to even learn to adopt different platforms which are much more widely used in other countries you're doing businesses in. For example, if you want to work in China, you will have to get a WeChat account. You will learn how to use Weibo, because those are the most common platforms people in China use. So overall, just try to keep your written communications formal, well structured, ensure that you have your spell checker on, and read your emails over before you hit send. One thing that you may want to try to do is setting a rule in your email settings to delay sending emails by a few minutes. Which is an absolute lifesaver when you realize that you've sent an email without the attachments that you meant to include, or you did not include the people you intended in the email, but you've made a mistake, say on the date and time for something. So a well-written communication will make you seem a lot more polished, a lot more professional, and a lot more knowledgeable. So it will really make a difference in the way that others perceive you. And then one more other thing to consider, and then to help you make you a little bit more self-aware of how you are and how you react to things, is eye contact. So eye contact, smiling, and body language. So let's take a look at this. You will think that, you know, smiling and an open body language and eye contact would be a global, welcoming expression, an essential way to interacting with people. But believe it or not, in countries like Russia, for example, people you meet will show you their most serious face and stern expressions. They will not break a smile or be very warm towards you, and that's a sign of respect for them. So while there are countries where you are expected not to make eye contact, in the UK you are expected to make strong eye contact. So look at people straight in the eye when you're speaking to them, and don't be afraid to, you know, pay attention and to what they're doing. And a little tip for those of you who may be undertaking virtual interviews this year, when you're in an interview, try to look straight into your laptop's camera rather than the window where the interviewer's video is showing, as that creates the illusion that you're looking someone straight in the eye instead. And then just a bit of a caveat here that I wanted to point out is that you will find that body language and, you know, smiling and eye contact is not always representative of culture, but of a person's personal style. And you know, if a person doesn't want to relate or engage to you, they might find that it's easier for them to look away from you and to remain very closed off. So there are scenarios, and you know, don't get offended by that, because there are certain scenarios where, for example, interviewers are expected to do this, to be a little bit more closed off, to not to exhibit any emotion or encouragement towards you, or to give anything away, so as not to disadvantage other candidates. So, you know, even if someone is not completely as open and smiling and warm towards you, do not take it personally, because it might be, one, a requirement of them not to be that way, or two, just a sign of their own personal preference, or it might just take longer for them to warm up to you. And then a few more tips there about speaking, tone, your pace and style. One, how you perceive others, and two, what you can do to be understood a little bit better as well. So one thing to point out is that when we talk to people, we always think that it's all about what we say. But then there's the 3 V's that we need to keep in mind when it comes to communications, which is verbal, vocal, and visual. And you will actually find that the words that we say, the words that we use, essentially the content of our of our conversation, it's less effective unless it gets accompanied by you know, a good tone of voice and a good body language, because that's what helps keep our audience engaged, and that's what helps carry our message across as well. Because when someone is talking to you, you might find that you look at them a lot more than you listen to them. So first you look at, you know, how they behave, and, you know, again, how we mentioned, you know, animosity, moving their hands, sorry, not animosity, how animated they are, moving their hands, their tone of voice, and then you might actually pay more close attention to what exactly they're saying and to the content and context of their words. So consider this when interacting with people. What is your own speaking style? Are you using flamboyant, flowery, or like embellished language? Are you talking in a calm and measured manner? If you come from a nation that tends to talk a lot, or maybe even fast, consider slowing down a bit. And this applies a lot to those countries we saw in the top of the triangle in that red multi-active corner, such as Latin America, Greece, India. So consider your pace so other people can keep up with you and understand you better. I know a lot of you today may not be native English speakers, so consider speaking slower so as to give yourself time to think of what you're saying and construct grammatically correct sentences and enunciate words better. If you have an accent, don't consider this a disadvantage. I have an accent. I am not a native English speaker, but this has not been a contributing factor to stop me from, you know, getting a job in the UK or work from people from various backgrounds. Even English speakers don't have a uniform accent, and you'll find that people from, say, the south of the UK, for example, tend to have a softer accent. They have what some of them might call a posh or a BBC accent. And then you'll find that, even native English speakers might not always understand each other because of the differences in pronunciation and accent and the words they use. So, don't find it too troubling if you can't understand the Irish, the Scottish, the Kiwis, or even the Mancunian accent. It's very common, and it grows of you and becomes easier with time. Just a bit of a pointer for, again, for the non-English speakers, don't be afraid to ask people to slow down or to explain something if it's something that you haven't understood. People are usually very accommodating, so try using phrases like, pardon me, I'm sorry, but I didn't quite catch that. Can you please repeat yourself? Just to clarify what people have said. A tip for the English speakers that might be with us today, and this equally applies to you. Don't be afraid to ask people to repeat themselves if what they have said did not make sense to you. Just make sure that you're polite about it, because I'll find that non-native speakers are very sensitive and sometimes self-conscious of their language skills, even though their language skills might be really good. So just be patient with them and try not to interrupt them. Like, give them the time and the space to communicate with you effectively. Also, when I work with international audiences, I find that even if the person I'm talking to has an excellent level of English, I try my best to phrase things as easily and plainly as possible, just to make it easier for them and to help them understand what I'm saying. And so I will be 100% certain that what I'm saying makes sense to them and that I'm getting my message across. So one more thing to consider when working with non-native English speakers, for example, is that their English level may be excellent, and I find that sometimes non-native speakers do amazingly well in written and formal communications, like phrasing emails, for example. But because they were not brought up in an English-speaking country or in England, for example, they may struggle a little bit more with everyday conversation. They may have a hard time understanding slang, pop culture references, phrases you will use every day, such as, oh, I'm feeling under the weather, which means I'm feeling unwell, or, oh, it's raining cats and dogs outside, which means it's raining very heavily. So keep your language clear and simple by avoiding jargon, and then consider how some of the idioms or phrases you're using might not translate well, and adjust your language and vocabulary accordingly. And lastly, consider tones. You will find that some languages come with lots of tonalities. Some may even change tones so rapidly that may sound like singing to you. And it's certainly important to try to speak by putting emphasis on certain words rather than by being monotone, as that will help the listener remain more engaged. So if you're concerned that you have a very monotone way of speech and don't change your tonality a lot, don't worry, just take a deep breath, try to give your voice more volume, more energy, and by speaking louder, you will be also perceived as more confident, I think. So just a little bit more on how to engage with others and create that lasting relationship and build rapport. So, is that word that we always use, networking? And what is networking and how do we build relationships with others? So there's far too much I can say about networking across from country to country. And when things return to normal and you have the chance to go to a networking event, even if this is something outside of your comfort zone, I think just be brave and go. This is the only way to master it and to give it a try and to learn by observing others. The important thing to remember is that it might be easier to target people that you have something in common with. So look for those commonalities. This could be anything from having studied the same degree, having grown up at the same city, or even having attended the same university. So I find that alumni, for example, are a great starting point for you to contact someone out of the blue to network with, or to ask questions and ask for insights. And this is what we call a cold approach, is when you haven't been introduced to someone and then out of the blue you contact them saying, hi, I'd like to get connected with you to talk to you about this and this and this, or to find out about what you do in your role, or how your organization is like, and so on. So for cold approaches like this one, I make a lot of this like to international organizations, trying to get them to engage with our university and give opportunities to our students. But I also do find that even though I've been doing this for a long time now, I find that the response rate is not always great. I might be getting one response every 10 emails or every LinkedIn connections request I said. So don't get disheartened. Just keep reaching out to people and keep trying your best. Just keep in mind that be mindful of other people's busy schedules and conflicting responsibilities. And what I always find helps is doing your research and contacting a specific person, not just a generic email address. So do try to be very mindful of these things as well. And then once you're connected with someone, then comes that big question of, do you immediately go into a meeting with them? Do you go down to business from the very start, or do you take the time for small talk and to get to know them a little bit better and to have some, a bit of a chit chat perhaps in advance? So in some countries, and again, we'll see that the Arab nations, for example, it is absolutely essential to have an informal conversation, a chit chat, rather than delve straight into business. And there has to be an informal chat before you even get into a meeting, or you even agree to do business together. So in regions like the Scandinavia, on the other hand, you'll go straight into a meeting and you'll talk only about what's needed, what's on the agenda, to be more effective and more efficient. In the UK, I find that it is helpful to have a little bit of a small talk and to build rapport because that helps like build rapport with colleagues and clients. But keep it light and special, keep it light and don't ask any intrusive questions, especially if you don't know each other very well. So try to focus on open-ended questions rather than yes or no questions, just to keep the conversation going, and keep to like safe topics and friendly like discussion, including the weather, weekend plans, sports, your journey to a destinations. And then there's certainly some topics to avoid, especially during networking early on in your relationship with someone, which is like questions around how old someone might be, how much they might be earning, where they live, their family situation, if they're married, if they have children. People tend to be a little bit more forthcoming about these things themselves, but don't necessarily ask them and don't necessarily assume that they might be married because they might be older than you, for example. And then there's other topics such as politics or religion or current affairs that I will say approach with like caution. Interestingly, at different parts of the world, again, you see a bit of a difference there in an approach. For example, I find that North American people will be much more open to talking about their salaries and how much they earn, while that's a very sensitive and intrusive topic to talk to someone in the UK. So keep this in mind, that it's not always the same, but that's a bit of a nice pointer there about some topics that you might want to avoid moving forward. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out how there's a few ways to like help you maintain that lasting relationship. So to appear a little bit more interesting, you might want to use humor, as it can be a great icebreaker. But again, be very mindful how it might not translate well, and a joke might not always cross across cultures. Therefore, always show some sensitivity to cultural nuances. People in all cultures laugh. People all everyone likes to smile. Everyone likes a joke, but we all laugh about different things. So be very careful and research in advance. Beware, and again, is beware of those topics and making jokes about topics that may be considered taboo or more sensitive. So, for example, I will avoid to have a conversation around, like, say, Brexit or the Hong Kong and China relationship. So be aware, do your research, and avoid making any jokes that might not translate well. Keep in mind that it's not all about what you say, but there's also like non-verbal signals that might tell you how well your relationship might be going with someone. So you yourselves might want to like focus on active listening, and as that's a great signal that you're being attentive. But also when you talk with each other, look out for what is not being said, like what, if someone is taking long pauses, if they're contemplating your responses, if they're avoiding confrontation. So for example, East Asian countries will pause for longer between in conversations, and they will take like much longer before like it's their turn to talk. So, and it might be because they're avoiding confrontation, but sometimes they might also like use silence as a sign of respect. So again, moving back to what we said about not native speakers and not native English speakers, you might find that it takes them a little longer to process what you have said. So someone's body language can sometimes like really tell you their level of understanding of what you're saying, and then you might find that it might be useful for you to repeat yourself or to summarize something again for them, just to help them be on the same page with what you discussed. And this would really help you like building rapport. And what building rapport means is to make it easier for you to communicate with each other, ask for favors, and be more comfortable with each other. And it takes practice. So start early while at university. If you're an international student, develop your friendships to include people in the UK and vice versa. And this will really help you gain exposure and normalize different cultures, as well as helped you really improve your language skills, especially if you're not a native speaker. So building rapport in business environments in the UK will mean, for example, that you're more comfortable to disagree with each other. And it is absolutely okay in the UK to question things, to vocalize your opinions, and to suggest alternative solutions. And in fact, it is encouraged a lot by employers. And they're really looking for employees with that critical thinking skill and rigor. In other countries, such as Asia, again, be a little bit more mindful, but on the other hand, they might have a bit more of a hierarchical and model of working, and seniority might play a huge role. So you have to respect the chain of command. So disagreeing might have to be a little bit more subtle. So you have to be very tactful in pointing out errors to your seniors. And there's that concept of saving face in countries in Asia, which means that you should try not to embarrass someone by pointing out their mistakes and disagreeing with them too much, as that will may make them like flustered. And if someone loses face, for them it might be perceived as a sign of like losing their dignity, losing their honor, or like reputation. So be very mindful of that. And don't forget, we are who we are. We're defined by like a multitude of like factors: our culture, religion, upbringing, ethnicity, different things. We're like a mosaic of all these things. So depending on our cultures, some of these factors might be more dominant than others. Just remember to be confident and to use your time at the university to really understand who you are a little bit better, and how other people are. So just to sum up and finish and wrap up here, assumptions and generalizations can be helpful, but also dangerous. So if based on too little information, so try not to pigeonhole people. Use this as a way of being aware of what's important to other people and what's normal to them. But don't take what is normal for you as granted, because as we said, people differ from each other. So by being aware of these communication traits, it's surprisingly how quickly you learn to be more flexible, more adaptable, and to really work with people much better, because you can foresee how they're likely to react. And there's like lots of like benefits for that. So this can promote harmony in relationships by allowing for empathy and understanding to develop. And when we see that, most of our reactions come from how we've been programmed by our culture. So if you take a step back, again, you can learn to adjust, and depending on who we are in front of us, be a little bit more flexible and understanding. And one last thing I wanted to point out and leave you with that is to have confidence. And it will be impossible for you to know how to behave around every single person. And it is okay to make mistakes and learn from your experience. So even if you have the best intentions, you may still inadvertently make an etiquette mistake. We live in such a global world, and by coming to university, you have already interacted with so many people from different cultures that do give yourself some credit, as you will probably already know and do lots of those those things without you realizing it. So, you know, difference can be uncomfortable, style switching can be difficult, but, you know, never be afraid to ask questions. And if you're unsure about business etiquette in the UK or generally across the world, do drop your career service an email and we'll be very happy to advise you. So that was the end of my presentation. I know we've very close to the finish time, but I would like to allow for some time for questions if you do have any of them, or for your own comments. I'd be very happy to hear what you think, whether your experiences have been the same or different, and generally if you have your own tips to give to each other. So please feel free to ask any questions that you might have now, and I'll try to answer as many of them as possible. And I have put my LinkedIn link there and a QR code that you can follow. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you have to run to a different meeting now. I will take some time to answer questions, but if you do have to run, do feel free to connect with me and put some of those business etiquette things I discussed today in practice. So I'm just going to take a minute to go through questions now, and I'll try and answer as many of them as possible. Okay, a great question here that I should have probably answered through the presentation. So this person has two questions. When we're considering how we should interact with people, should we prioritize where that person is from or which country they are? Or where we are from. So I know you've been in a situation where, you know, it's two people from different cultures and different countries, and say you were visiting, sorry, I think just to get the question right, you're visiting a country, I think this question is, and you know, should we prioritize where the person is from or where you physically are? So say you're in China, do you abide to the business etiquette in China, or because you're interacting with someone from India, you interact to the business etiquette in India? So I will say there's no rule here, is whatever you feel most comfortable with. But I find that in business environments specifically, you have to be very mindful of the dynamic, who the client is, or who is asking someone for a favor, or who is more senior, or who is you know, the person in power in a way. So if you're making a transaction with someone, then I think it would make more sense to you to just follow their own business etiquette rather than just follow the business etiquette of the country. If, however, you're with a colleague and that you know well, you're in a country and you're interacting with people from that country, then I will say do keep to the business etiquette of that country instead, unless there's a bit of a different dynamic there. And then the next question is, are there any recommendations when we are to send certain professional queries regarding the time or day of the week? I'd say be very mindful that people come on a Friday morning to work on with a full inbox, especially if they were not like working on a Friday. People might send more rush responses to you towards the end of the afternoon when they're ready to log off. So say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, sorry, I meant to say Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday tend to be better days. And when I'm doing events with students, I tend to find that those days tend to work better in regards with engagement as well. Only because I find that Monday is usually the first day of the week. People are still trying to find their feet, you know, plan ahead and sort of figure out what they're doing for the rest of the week. And then Friday is usually the day before the weekend. Everyone's looking forward to going home. They're a little bit more social. They want to make plans, so they might spend a little less time in their emails. Another question is it okay to refuse a handshake from someone of the opposite gender when you're in a country where it is the norm? What should I do to avoid offending the person? So I think this is very important to point out that it all comes down to your own personal preferences and what you're comfortable with. I think it is okay to refuse a handshake. It might be nice to offer an explanation. If it's for religious reasons, for example, just say, oh, I'm sorry, because of religious reasons, I avoid touching someone, or I'm trying to be careful because of coronavirus, and like we're meant to like avoid contact. So I think it's completely fine to say, and inform the other that, oh, where I'm coming from, instead of a handshake, we touch our chest instead, and this is what we do instead of a handshake. So no, I don't think someone will be offended by it, as long as you provide an explanation and you explain why you're doing this and what's your rationale behind it. I think people tend to be very respectful and understanding, and if someone takes offense at that, like from a very personal perspective, I would be very cautious of working with them in the future, because that tells me that they will not be accepting and open to working with people from different cultures in general. So I think this is all the time we've had today for questions. As I said, my LinkedIn account is there, so do feel free to contact me afterwards if you do have any additional questions that you want to ask me. I hope you found this presentation informative and useful. Just a reminder that this session is part of our Asia Careers Insight series, so please do have a look on the University of Manchester website, even if you're not a University of Manchester student, and sign up to more sessions that are coming up this and next week that you might find useful, and that will help you connect with employers and also upskill as well. And do let me know, do get in touch if you put any of the tips I've given you today in action, and I'll be very happy to hear of how you found them and how you've applied them in practice. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me today, for your engagement through your numerous connections, and I look forward to seeing you again soon at the future webinar. Bye.